All right, with the next two sections, I just combined them because they both kind of deal with some of the major battles in the different theaters of World War II. A lot of this is global history, so you'll come back and do it in the high school, but there are a couple of the big battles that I definitely want us to take a peek at. We're also going to look at the Holocaust and post-war plans for Europe. All right, so we start off with the Allies advancing into Germany. We know that to its greatest extent, Adolf Hitler, let me get my little pen here. We know to the greatest extent Nazi Germany is going to encompass almost all of Europe, right? He even advances into the Soviet Union. So the Allies realized that their best choice of defeating the Axis powers is to advance up through the Mediterranean and up through Italy. All right. Now, of the two, the Nazi army is definitely the stronger, but they're currently engaged with the Soviet Union. So Italy would be left on its own to defend the Italian peninsula. All right. The idea was to advance through North Africa this way, cross the Mediterranean, and kind of use Italy to establish a foothold in Europe. Whoa, that was a crazy transition. All right, looking specifically at the war in Europe. All right, here's a name that you need to know: General Erwin Rommel. All right, he was the Nazi general. Okay, the Axis powers are being very successful in North Africa. They're advancing towards the Suez Canal on the eastern side of Africa before the Allies land on the west side. And slowly start to advance, all right? And then May 1943 is when the Allied powers finally force all the Axis powers in North Africa to surrender, which sets the stage for the invasion of Italy, all right? So July 1943 is when the Allies start their invasion. By this point, the Italian people have turned on Mussolini, right? So you can see this would be North Africa here, all right? So we're extending through Sicily, right, and then invading the Italian mainland from there, and then hopefully Allied forces will continue up north through Italy. Long fighting, right? Definitely, if you're looking at any kind of assault, right, over water is going to be difficult, but the Allied forces are able to be successful and continue to advance through the north. Right. Now, looking specifically at what the Nazis are doing, we know that one of the biggest mistakes that Adolf Hitler makes is he breaks his non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, and he declares war on the Soviet Union. All right, he's not prepared for the winter. He's not prepared for the fierce fighting that is going to ensue. Right, and the two forces are going to meet at the Battle of Stalingrad. All right, now this is considered on the Eastern Front. This is considered to be the turning point because the Soviets are able to defend their ground and defeat the Nazis, and it's kind of like the first major defeat that Adolf Hitler is going to meet. And it was almost like, if you think about it from what are the citizens thinking, it was almost like a direct battle between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, and which army was going to fight stronger. And Joseph Stalin's army was able to be successful. Germany's forced to retreat back through Germany, so combine that with the Allies coming up through the north, right? And this is you're going to start to see the tide of the war starting to turn. All right, next we're going to look at D-Day. All right, D-Day is sometimes referred to as Normandy. All right, so I wrote it up here for you. All right, it's going to be really, if you're looking at it, it's the first major Allied victory in Europe. All right, so sometimes this is referred to as the turning point on the Western Front. All right, but you need to know it both ways, as D-Day and Normandy. This is where your Call of Duty games, all right, usually come in. At some point in your Call of Duty games, you're going to be reenacting this. Right, it was the largest military operation in the history of the world in terms of troops amount, in terms of planning. All right. Essentially, what happens is the Allies know that they need to invade mainland Europe, and Hitler thinks that the invasion is going to come somewhere up here, because it's the shortest distance across the English Channel. All right. So what the Allies do is they send General Patton, right, who was a popular, successful American general. They send him and some forces towards Dover, which makes Hitler think that that's where the invasion is coming from. But the invasion is really going to come here, and this beach is going to be called Normandy. There are actually a bunch of different beaches, right? But the main beach is called Normandy. All right. Allies are going to lose a tremendous amount of of soldiers, but are ultimately going to end up being successful, being able to establish a foothold in Europe, and then they can start to advance through Europe this way. So if you're thinking about it now, if you're looking at a whole map of Europe, which we will in a second, the Allies are going to be advancing towards Berlin on all fronts. And interesting side note here, all right, this military operation is going to be headed by the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. We're going to come back and be talking about him in the next chapter. He actually becomes president after World War II. All right, so looking at continuing the advance, France and the Allies after D-Day are going to continue to invade and try and liberate France first. All right, they are able to free Paris, all right, which was one of the first major cities that Hitler was able to accomplish. Hitler tries to mount an assault, another offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Right, he's going to be defeated. So at this point, he is just his army is reeling. Right, they're continuously retreating back to Berlin. All right, Hitler starts to realize that the end is near. All right, here is a map of Europe. It's going to be showing you, all right, you got a timeline up here, so if you need to pause this, please do and just take a peek at it. It's on class zone too, so we could always pull it up in class if need be as well. All right, the blue arrow is showing you the Axis advances. I told you earlier on in the notes that the Allies start to advance through North Africa. Right, they defeat the Axis forces here at El Alamein. They're trying to get to the Suez Canal. Right, then the Allies turn their focus on invading up through Italy. Right, you then have D-Day coming this way. You have the Battle of Stalingrad. The Soviets are advancing this way. So pretty much the walls are closing in on Adolf Hitler. Right, and like I said, he knows that the end is coming. All right, and this map should look familiar. It's one of the map that we did earlier on in the chapter. All right, so looking at the end of the war in Europe, all right, February 1945, we have the Yalta Conference, all right, which would just be the name of the location, all right. You have your big three again. You have Winston Churchill here, okay, yes, the guy from English class. FDR here, he's actually going to die, pass away in a couple of months, and then the dictator of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, all right. And one of the things that they're talking about is what to do with post-war Europe in terms of how are we going to try and recover from this? And one of the things they agree on is to have peacekeeping, international peacekeeping organization, kind of like the League of Nations, right? But it's going to be even stronger because the United States is going to be involved. When FDR passes away, his vice president, Harry Truman, right, becomes president, and he's going to lead the United States through the remaining months of the war. All right, one of the things, we talked about it earlier on in the chapter, was the Holocaust. People suspected that there were some atrocities going on throughout the war, but nobody ever really knew the extent of it until they started to expand, right, or advance through Europe. And they're starting to go through Germany and Poland and Austria, right? And Allied troops start to see, right, these concentration camps, and they're freeing the Jews and other prisoners of the camps. You're looking at over 6 million Jews. It's Jews and other, everybody kind of focuses on Jews, but it's going to be over 6 million, all right, different ethnic groups, primarily the Jews, that the Nazis are going to be housing in these camps, all right? But like I said, as the Allies are advancing on either end, right, they start liberating and freeing the prisoners of these camps. Right, May 7th, 1945, that's considered VE Day, which would be victory in Europe, so VE Day. That would be the end of the war in Europe, right? And this is also important to note here that in May 1945, it's the Soviets that get to Berlin first. There's almost like a race between the Americans and the British on one side and the Soviets on the other side. They were both trying to capture Hitler alive. He ends up committing suicide in his bunker in Berlin. Right, now we shift our focus all the way to the Pacific. So now we're going to kind of travel back in time. We're back right at the end of Pearl Harbor. Right, Japan is going to continuously expand. So this map here is doing a good job of showing you, okay, Manchuria, Korea, China, all the way down through Southeast Asia. All right, and then as the American Army or American Navy starts to get involved, all right, we start trying to, free some of this land. So the big battle you need to know for the Pacific theater is the Battle of Midway, which would be here. And a way to remember it is it was midway, roughly, between Hawaii and Japan, right? And that's an important battle because that was a battle that was fought, it was a naval battle, but it was fought where the ships never actually saw each other because of the distance that they're away from each other, right? So you started having massive artillery, airplanes, air battles, things like that. All right, so now we're looking at, here's a key word here, you need to know this. Essentially what it means is if you look at the South Pacific, it's called island hopping. If you look at the South Pacific, all right, or at least the whole Pacific here, you'll see a tremendous amount of islands. Now, the Japanese are able to establish strong defensive positions on all these islands, so the Allies figured that if they tried to free every single island, right, then that would lead to a massive amount of casualties. So what they did was they identified key islands that they could then use as bases to bomb and attack, the next key island. So it's referred to as island hopping, okay, because they're kind of hopping around the Pacific from key island to key island to key island. All right. The Battle of Guadalcanal is the first major land victory, right? And this is something that's people always find it interesting is the word kamikaze. Excuse me. All right. Kamikaze pilots. They were pilots who, throughout the course of a battle, when they realized that either A, they were out of ammunition, or B, it was their only option, right, they would actually fly their airplane right into American ships. They would be kind of like a suicide pilot, in hopes that the explosion of their plane hitting would cripple that ships. And to a large extent, it was successful, and it did keep the Allies, or keep the Americans from, because the Americans fought primarily in the Pacific theater, did keep them from advancing as fast as they would like. Right. The big island, and I know we're familiar with this from our Washington, D.C. trip, and some of us did it as our model, the Iwo Jima Memorial. Okay, these were two key islands, Iwo Jima and Okinawa. All right, incredible loss of life because the Japanese were able to fortify them. But if we're looking at an invasion of Japan, these were two islands that we definitely needed to capture. All right, and then here's where the war ends, all right, the war in the Pacific, with the decision to drop nuclear weapons. This is the first time in history that weapons of this magnitude have ever been used, right? It starts back in the American government started to realize that eventually an all-out invasion of Japan would cost a tremendous amount of lives. You're looking at upwards of 1 million soldiers being killed. So the government creates what's referred to as the Manhattan Project. Right, and their goal was to develop atomic weapons. So the two, as the United States starts to advance through the Pacific, Japan refuses any offer to surrender. So August 6th, 1945, the first atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. All right, and if you're thinking about it, and you could always ask Mr. Johnson, he'll always talk to you about the science behind it, right? But from a socialist perspective, I can tell you, okay, the whole idea here was to send a quick message, save as many troops as we can, right? Looking at this map down here, this is showing you the before, this is showing you the after, all right? You're talking massive damage, massive loss of life. The Japanese do not surrender, so 3 days later, the United States drops another atomic bomb on Nagasaki, right, which then ultimately forces the Japanese to surrender. Right, so the question we have here now, and we'll talk about it because it becomes a major factor for the remaining part of the 20th century, is the use of nuclear weapons. All right, is it the right thing to do? Is it moral? Is it immoral? Is it unfair? Because it does attack civilians and not just military personnel. We'll look at that in more detail, definitely.